What's up, everybody? Thanks for clicking this video. Thanks for tuning into my channel. My name is Simon Hill, Black American from Louisiana, coming to you live from Budapest, Hungary. Today is January 17th, 2026, about 7:15 p.m. where I'm at right now. And we are continuing our 17th book in our Book to React series, where we read an entire text from cover to cover, no matter what, rain, hail, sleet, snow. This is episode 20 of A History of Psychology from Antiquity to Modernity, written by the mysterious professor, Thomas Hardy Leahey. The reason I began reading this book is because last semester at my university, where I'm studying sociology right now, I decided to take a course on the history of psychology, and it ended up becoming a epic of studying the history of philosophy, Western thought in general. The course was only 4 or 5 classes, I forgot exactly, but each class was about 3 hours long. And I went to all of them. I went to all except one of them because I just missed it. I think one day I got it backwards on the day it was supposed to be because it was like every other week. Anyway, ended up taking this course. The lectures were cool. Ended up taking the first exam and I failed it. Oh no, I failed it. Even though I began reading this entire textbook from cover to cover before I started taking the exam, but obviously we haven't finished it yet. I took it for the second time after continuing to read the textbook and studying independently outside of reading this book on live with the people on YouTube, and got a 5 out of 5, an excellent, perfect score. Yes, I'm a big dog outside. Yes, indeed. And I'm so proud of myself because I worked extremely hard last semester. I took the most credits I've ever taken. I think it was something like 32 credits last semester. And yeah, man, I have a year and a half left on my university studies. Looking forward to graduating and getting my second bachelor's degree. Then I'm going to go get my master's, and I don't know what. Hell, I might do it 2 times again too because I'm that hard with it. I'm that hard with it. I'm unstoppable. But no, I'm very appreciative of all my professors and the university for giving this crazy young man an opportunity. And if you want to continue to support a young black man learning the white man's technology out here in Europe, then donate to this channel because all the money I get goes towards paying my tuition. Oh, yes, it does. And it's about 2,400 euros per semester. So if you want to drop that bag off, you see that donation link under this video. If you don't want to donate to the cause, then just continue watching because the ad revenue also helps. Anyway, even though we have passed this course, even though I'll probably take another psychology class again in my life because psychology is not my favorite subject, and this has not been my favorite book, and that class was just okay. We're still going to continue reading, and we're going to finish what we started, because what does it take to succeed in anything? Not giving up. Not quitting. The only guaranteed way to lose is to quit. And that's what we will do. Besides, we only have a few more chapters left. We're going to be starting chapter 10 today, the psychology of adaptation. And we're going to be continuing until how many more chapters? Sorry, this computer is kind of slow. We have 4 more chapters. Chapter 10 is one of the longest chapters in the book, so we're going to break this up into 2 halves. I will only be reading for an hour today. I have some other things I need to do. So what we're going to do is read for an hour, probably until 8:20 p.m. my time, and hopefully we'll be able to cover the first 22 or 23 pages of this chapter, so that way we can break this up into the second half and finish all of chapter 10 by tomorrow. Sorry I've been offline. I've been working hella hard. I'm paying bills, paying rent, paying utilities, paying tuition, paying to fix my bike, paying for new clothes, new shoes, paying for regular things like groceries, public transport tickets, all that type of stuff. Bills. Can you pay my bills? No, nigga. No, you will pay your own bills. So that's where we're at with it right now. Plus, as you know as well, YouTube is trying to always take this channel down because of the things I talk about. So I've been fighting. I've been fighting a good fight. You know what I mean? Nelson just jumped into the live stream. He says, you still doing the live stream? Well, of course, we're doing the live stream right now. This is one of the live streams. But like I said, we will read until about 8:20 p.m. my time. And then we're going to come back on live about 8:30 p.m. to do the live call-in show, where if you have any disagreements with me, anything you want to say to your boy, you can say it to me directly on the Zoom call. And we'll also be continuing watching the documentary Can't Get You Out of My Head that was requested by Nelson Moreno. And we will hopefully finish episode 4. I believe we're 3 episodes in, and we have about 3 more episodes to go, so we'll watch episode 4. Without further ado, we're starting here, The Psychology of Adaptation on page 283, and let's get into it. The last founding psychology we will examine has proven to be the most durable and influential of them all. In the 20th century, the German psychology of consciousness quickly became an anachronistic product of 19th century German thought. Psychoanalysis is a dying movement, as we will see later. The approach that modern psychologists, first in England and later in America, have found most attractive and useful is a psychology based on evolution. With the ascendance of American psychology in the 20th century, the psychology of adaptation in one form or another has dominated academic psychology. The Darwinian Revolution. The Newtonian Cartesian mechanical world was as changeless as the Aristotelian one. God, or some other creator, has constructed a marvelous machine, perfect in conception and endless in time. Each object, each biological species was fixed for eternity, changelessly perfect in obedience to fixed natural laws. Such a worldview was equally consistent with Plato's forms, Aristotle's essences, and Christian theology. In this view, qualitative change was something unusual in nature, given the Cartesian Newtonian concept that matter is inert, incapable of acting, and passive only, and that spontaneous change is the origin of new species. The mutation of existing species seemed impossible, as each was a form unto itself. In the atmosphere of progress characteristic of the Enlightenment, however, this static view of nature began to change. There was an old Aristotelian theological concept that aided acceptance of the idea of evolution, the great chain of being, or Aristotle's scala naturae. The chain was viewed by medievals as a measure of a creature's nearness to God and consequently its degree of spiritual perfection. To early advocates of Lamarckian evolution, it became a record of the ascent of living things toward nature's crowning perfection, humankind. The idea that living forms might change over time was also aided by the romantic and vitalistic conception of living things that had opposed the mechanism of Mersenne and Descartes. If living things spontaneously changed in the course of their own development from life to death, and if they could give rise to new life through reproduction, then it became more plausible to think that living forms might alter themselves over great reaches of time. The vitalist, romantic conception of evolution was not mechanical, however, for it endowed matter with godlike attributes. For the Newtonian, inert matter was set in mechanical motion by an intelligent, purposeful creator. For the vitalist, matter itself is intelligent and purposeful. Vitalism was thus a romantic view of nature, self-perfecting and self-directing, progressively unfolding itself throughout time. Contemporary discoveries in science and elsewhere also paved the way for evolutionary thought. Physicians became more knowledgeable about the development of animals, including humans, from fetus to adult form. This developmental transformation was dramatic and qualitative, a change of form, not merely of size, as ancient accounts had suggested. Thus, it became easier to think about the development of life on Earth as a series of qualitative changes as one species became transformed into a new one. Voyages of exploration also helped facilitate evolutionary thinking, making it hard to fit existing species into fixed Platonic boxes. Human beings, for example, seemed different from every other living animal until visitors to Africa began to describe gorillas, orangutans, and chimpanzees. Similarity to existing creatures made it easier to accept the idea that we might have descended from them. The idea that living things had changed during the course of life on Earth, the idea of descent with modification, was becoming commonplace in scientific circles by about 1800. The theoretical problem was to explain how evolution occurred. Any theory of evolution needs at least two components. The first is an engine of change, a mechanism that creates offspring that are in some way different from their parents. The second is a means of preserving the changes. If one organism's innovation cannot be passed on to its offspring, it will be lost and evolution will not take place. Going to figure 10.1. Charles Darwin, Newton's equal as a scientific thinker. Publication of his Origin of Species in 1859 was the most important intellectual event in the 19th century. Darwinian thinking continues to revolutionize the life and sciences, including psychology. One more thing I have to say before we move on. I'm very disturbed once again by Thomas Hardy Leahey's latent Islamophobia, because there was an Islamic thinker, a Muslim scholar, I believe during the time of Al-Andalus in Muslim Spain, the time of the Moors broadly. I don't remember the guy's name, but he came up with a theory of evolution as well that was foundational to understanding evolutionary science and biology. And him not mentioning the Muslim thinker who thought of that goes to show Thomas Hardy Leahey is very selective when it comes to telling the story of Western civilization. Or thought. Continuing here. Romantic evolution. Jean-Baptiste Lamarck, born 1744 and died in 1829, proposed the first important theory of evolution. Lamarck, a naturalist well known for his work in taxonomy, was the most scientific exponent of a romantic view of evolution. The engine of change proposed by Lamarck was the vitalist thesis that when environments changed, organisms had to change their behavior to survive, and as organisms adapted to their surroundings, nature drove them from simple forms to increasingly more complex forms. This was linked to the romantic claim that each living species possesses an innate drive to perfect itself. Each organism strives to adapt itself to its surroundings and change itself as it does so, developing various muscles, acquiring new physical traits or behavioral habits. Lamarck then claimed that a species preserves these acquired characteristics by somehow passing them on to its offspring. Thus, the results of each individual striving for perfection were preserved and passed on, and over generations, species of plants and animals would improve themselves, fulfilling their drives for perfection. Modern genetics has destroyed the romantic, vitalist vision of nature. In the absence of genetics, however, the inheritance of acquired characteristics was plausible, and even Darwin from time to time accepted it, although he never accepted the vitalist view of matter. So, by Darwin's time, evolution was a concept up for discussion, rejected only by firm religionists and a few in the biological establishment who still accepted the fixity of species. A naturalistic but romantic conception of evolution was in place. Herbert Spencer, an English Lamarckian, had already coined the phrase survival of the fittest in 1852. And in 1849, a decade before the publication of Darwin's The Origin of Species, Alfred Lord Tennyson wrote in his greatest poem, In Memoriam, lines that foreshadowed the new view of evolution in the struggle for survival, a view of which Tennyson disapproved. Are God and nature then at strife, that nature lends such evil dreams? So careful of the type species she seems, so careless of the single life. Later in the poem, in a widely quoted line, Tennyson calls nature red in tooth and claw. Continuing here, the Victorian revolutionary Charles Darwin, born 1809 and died in 1882. Evolution did not long remain a poetic effusion, although Darwin's own grandfather, Erasmus Darwin, anticipated his grandson's theory in a scientific poem, Zoonomia. Nor could it remain a romantic fancy, inspiring but finally implausible. Darwin's achievement was to make evolution into a theory consistent with the rest of science by providing a non-teleological mechanism, natural selection, to replace Lamarck's romantic notion of organisms and species striving to perfect and improve themselves. Then a campaign to convince scientists and the public of the fact of evolution was needed. Darwin never campaigned himself. He was something of a hypochondriac. One biographer called him the perfect patient, and after his trip on the HMS Beagle, he became a recluse, rarely leaving his country home. The struggle for the survival of natural selection was carried on by others, most spectacularly by Thomas Henry Huxley, Darwin's bulldog. Shaping the theory. Darwin was a young naturalist who had the good fortune to be included on a round-the-world scientific voyage aboard the HMS Beagle from 1831 to 1836. Two key ideas began to emerge in Darwin's thinking during the voyage. In the South American rainforest, Darwin was deeply impressed by the sheer variety of living things. Nature spontaneously throws up variations of form within and between species. For example, in each hectare of the rainforest, there dwell several hundred different species of insects. On the Galapagos Islands, Darwin observed the set of finch species now known in his honor as Darwin's finches. While similar in overall shape, each species has a somewhat different beak. Moreover, each type of beak is suited to each species' means of foraging. Finches with long, thin beaks hunt for small insects in the bark of trees. Finches with shorter but sturdier beaks live off nuts or seeds that they break open. Darwin noted that it seemed likely each species had descended from a common ancestor, and each had changed over time to exploit a particular way of life. This is the central Darwinian principle of adaptation, the idea that evolution's result is to improve the fit between the species and its environment. Then, sometimes after his return to England, Darwin began to collect data on species, their variation and origin. In his The Autobiography of Charles Darwin in Selected Letters, he said that he collected facts on a wholesale scale, or on true Baconian principles. Part of his investigation centered on artificial selection, that is, on how breeders of plants and animals improve their stocks. Darwin talked with pigeon fanciers and horticulturalists and read their pamphlets. One pamphlet he read, The Art of Improving the Breeds of Domestic Animals, written in 1809 by John Sebright, indicated that nature, too, selected some traits and rejected others, just as breeders did. A severe winter or a scarcity of food, by destroying the weak and unhealthful, has all the good effects of the most skillful selection. So by the 1830s, Darwin already had a rudimentary theory of natural selection. Nature produces innumerable variations among living things, and some of these variations are selected and preserved by the survival and reproduction of their bearers. Over time, isolated populations became adapted to their surroundings. What was entirely unclear was what maintained the system of selection. Why should there be improvement in species? In the case of artificial selection, the answer is clear. Selection is made by the breeder to produce a desirable kind of plant or animal. But what force in nature parallels the breeder's ideal? Darwin could not accept Lamarck's innate drive to perfection. The cause of selection must reside outside the organism, he insisted, but where? Darwin got his answer in 1838 while reading Thomas Malthus's essay on the principle of population, published in 1798, and Thomas Malthus lived from 1766 to 1834. Malthus addressed a problem that troubled the late Enlightenment. If science and technology had progressed, why did poverty, crime, and war still exist? Malthus proposed that although human productivity had improved, population growth always outstripped growth in the supply of goods, so that life is necessarily a struggle of too many people for too few resources. In his autobiography, Darwin stated he had at last got a theory on which he could work. It was the struggle for survival that caused natural selection. Creatures struggled over scarce resources, and those who were weak and unhealthful could not support themselves and died without offspring. The strong and healthy survived and procreated. In this way, favorable variations were preserved and unfavorable ones were eliminated. Struggle for survival was the engine of evolution, in which only successful competitors had heirs. Darwin need not have gone to Malthus for the concept of individual struggle for survival. As William Irvine points out, nature in her evolutionary aspects is almost tritely mid-Victorian. Darwin's theory delighted mid-century optimists who learned that nature moved forward on the sound business principle of laissez-faire. where culture meets science. Natural selection may have offended the pious, but not the Victorian businessman of the Industrial Revolution, who knew that life was a constant struggle that rewarded failure with poverty and disgrace. The improvement of the species from the struggle of individuals was Adam Smith's invisible hand all over again. It was also consonant with Edmund Burke's conservative vision of societies as collections of successful practices and values. Continuing. Formulating the theory. Darwin had arrived at the essentials of his theory by 1842, at which time he first set them on paper with no thought of publication. His theory can be summarized as a logical argument. First, from Malthus, Darwin holds that there is a constant struggle for existence because of the tendency of animals to outgrow their food sources. Later, he would recognize that the key struggle is the struggle to reproduce. Not only do creatures struggle merely to exist, they must compete with others of the same sex for access to the other sex. Typically, males compete with each other for access to females, making female choice a force in evolution. Second, nature constantly produces variant forms within and between species. Some variants are better adapted to the struggle for survival than others. Consequently, organisms possessing unfavorable traits will not reproduce, causing their traits to disappear. Finally, as small adaptive change follows small adaptive change over eons, species will differentiate from a common stock as each form adapts to its peculiar environment. Furthermore, environments will change, selecting new traits for perpetuation. And as environment succeeds environment, species will diverge ever more from their parent forms. Thus, the observed diversity of nature can be explained as the result of a few mechanical principles operating over millions of years, as species evolve from species. The theory, as it stood, was deficient. Without today's knowledge of genetics, the origin of variations and the nature of their transmission could not be explained. Darwin was never able to overcome these difficulties and was in fact pushed closer and closer to Lamarckianism as he defended his theories against critics. It is an irony of history that while Darwin was writing and defending the origin of species, an obscure Polish monk, George Mendel, born 1822 and died in 1884, was doing the work on heredity that eventually supplied the answer to Darwin's difficulties. Mendel's work, published and ignored in 1865, was rediscovered in 1900 and became the foundation of modern genetics. By the time Darwin died, he had earned burial in Westminster Abbey, and his thought had revolutionized the Western worldview. But not until the synthesis of genetics and natural selection into modern neo-Darwinian theory in the 1930s did evolution seriously affect biology. Darwin set his ideas down in 1842, but it is not clear why he did not then seek to publish them. Historians have proposed a number of explanations for Darwin's delay. Some psychoanalytically influenced historians have suggested that Darwin, who had once considered becoming a minister, was made neurotic by the materialistic implications of evolution and wanted to repress his own discovery. Others have said Darwin delayed because he got involved in other, less speculative and pressing projects, such as publishing his research from the Beagle and working for 8 years studying barnacles. So absorbed was Darwin in his barnacle work that his young son, visiting a friend's home, asked where his father did his barnacles. Other theories emphasize... I'm sorry, that was funny. Other theories emphasize Darwin's scientific caution. He knew the idea of evolution by natural selection was dangerous. It lacked the comforting progressive aspect of Lamarck's romantic theory, because in Darwin's formulation, evolution does not go anywhere because organisms are simply adapting to changes in their environments. If the theory was proposed prematurely, it might be rejected out of hand. He wanted to put out a complete and persuasively supported theory. Darwin also recognized that his ideas faced theoretical problems, foremost among them the existence of altruism in animals. How can altruism evolve in natural selection when altruism, by definition, involves acting to benefit other organisms or acting to benefit another organism at some cost to itself? Altruistic genes appear at first glance to be suicidal. In fact, this problem was not completely solved until the formulation of the idea of kin selection and reciprocal altruism in the 1960s and 70s. Publishing the theory. In any event, Darwin continued to develop his theory and accumulate the empirical support it would need to gain a hearing. On June 18, 1858, Darwin's hand was forced. He was stunned to discover that someone else had discovered his theory. He received a letter from Alfred Russel Wallace, born 1823 and died in 1913. Wallace was a fellow naturalist, but younger and bolder than Darwin. Wallace had been to South America and had been impressed by the natural variation of life there. In Southeast Asia, trapped in his tent by rain, he had read Malthus and had Darwin's insight. Writing to the foremost British biologist, Darwin, whom he did not know, Wallace attached a paper outlining his theory to Darwin to get it published. Darwin found himself in a quandary. He wanted to be known as the discoverer of natural selection, but it would be unseemly to deny Wallace credit too. So Darwin and some friends arranged that Wallace's paper and one by Darwin be read on July 1st, 1858, in their absence, to the Linnean Society of London, thus establishing Darwin and Wallace as co-discoverers of natural selection. Darwin rushed through a short version of his projected work on evolution, which appeared in 1859 as The Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection, or the preservation of favored races in the struggle for life. Ooh, favored races. It presented his theory backed by a mass of supporting detail. The Origin is an elegantly written book. Darwin was an acute observer of nature, and his pages are crammed with intricate descriptions of the interwoven nature of life. It was revised until its sixth edition in 1872, as Darwin tried to answer his scientific critics, unsuccessfully as it turned out, in ignorance of genetics. Darwin wrote numerous other works, including two on the descent of humans and their expression of emotion in humans and animals, which provided important foundations for the psychology of adaptation. Reception and influence of evolution by natural selection. The world was well prepared for Darwin's theory. The idea of evolution was already around, and when The Origin was published, learned men took it seriously in all quarters. Biologists and naturalists greeted the work with varying degrees of criticism. Part of Darwin's thesis that all living things descend from one common ancestor in the remote past was scarcely novel and was widely accepted. Great difficulties were seen with the theory of natural selection. However, as it was still easy for scientists to hang on to some form of Lamarckism. Pardon, I want to try to put this in the, view? Dual stream? Can we do that? Okay. Let's see. I hope that worked. I want to see if I can put on dual stream for people to tune in on this, on the shorts feed. Anyway, let's see if it works. I don't know. Anyway, continuing here. So, the world was well prepared for Darwin's theory. The idea of evolution was already around, and when The Origin was published, learned men took it seriously in all quarters. Biologists and naturalists greeted the work with varying degrees of criticism. Part of Darwin's thesis that all living things descend from one common ancestor in the remote past was scarcely novel and was widely accepted. Great difficulties were seen with the theory of natural selection, however, and it was still easy for scientists to hang on to some form of Lamarckism, to see the hand of God in progressive evolution, or to exempt humans from natural selection, as Darwin had, as yet, said nothing about them. Nevertheless, the implication that humans were part of nature was now hanging in the air, and Freud called Darwinism the second great blow to the human ego. In many respects, Darwinism was not a revolution, but part of the fulfillment of Enlightenment naturalism. Darwin cared only for his theory of natural selection, but others wove it into the emergent tapestry of a scientific image of humankind. Herbert Spencer, who had believed in the survival of the fittest before Darwin and applied it ruthlessly to humans and society, was one forceful proponent of metaphysical Darwinism. Another was T.H. Huxley, born 1825 and died in 1895. Huxley used evolution to batter the Bible, miracles, spiritualism, and religion in general. Ooh, he was dangerous. Huxley did not Huxley did much to popularize Darwinism as a naturalistic metaphysics. Darwin's theory did not begin the 19th century crisis of conscience. Profound worries about the existence of God and about the meaning of life went back at least to Pascal in the 17th century. Darwinism was not the beginning of the scientific challenge to the old medieval Renaissance worldview. It was the culmination of this challenge, making it most difficult to exempt human beings from immutable, determinate natural law. In Man's Place in Nature, published in 1863, Huxley carefully related mankind to the living apes, lower animals, and fossil ancestors, showing that we did indeed evolve from lower forms of life, that no creation was needed. In the hands of people like Huxley, science then became not just the destroyer of illusions, but also a new metaphysics offering a new kind of salvation through science itself. The journalist Winwood Reade wrote in The Martyrdom of Man, "The God of light, the spirits of knowledge, the divine intellect is gradually spreading over the planet. Hunger and starvation will then be unknown. Disease will be extirpated. Immortality will be invented. Man will then be perfect. He will therefore be what the vulgar worship as a god." The hope is similar to Comte's positivism, which Huxley called Catholicism minus Christianity. For some, the new religion of scientific humanity was clearly at hand, also boasted of science's practical fruits. Every chemically pure substance employed in manufacture, every abnormally fertile race of plants, or rapidly growing and fattening breed of animals. Darwinism did not instigate Victorian religious doubt, but it did intensify it. Darwin effected a Newtonian revolution in biology, robbing nature of her romantic capital. Darwin effected a Newtonian revolution in biology, robbing nature of her romantic capital N, reducing evolution to random variation and happenstance victory in the struggle for survival. The beginning of the reduction of biological nature to chemical nature that was completed with the discovery of DNA had begun. In psychology, Darwinism led to the psychology of adaptation. Assuming evolution, one may ask how mind and behavior, as distinct from bodily organs, help each creature adapt to its surroundings. Skinner carefully modeled his radical behaviorism on Darwinian variation, selection, and retention. Skinner, however, tended to underestimate the degree to which each species, including Homo sapiens, has a nature shaped by its evolutionary heritage. Today, evolutionary psychology is developing a more complete picture of human nature. Many, however, could not accept naturalism or were depressed by it. Huxley himself, in his last writings, said that man was unique among animals, for by his intelligence he could lift himself out of the natural cosmic process and transcend organic evolution. Similar sentiments, not at all uncommon, both among scientists and lay people, help account for the popularity both before and after Darwin's time of various semi- or pseudo-scientific trends based on the uniqueness of humanity. Beginning with Bishop Wilberforce and continuing with William Jennings Bryan, defenders of the Bible attacked evolution, only to be crushed by such powerful personalities as T.H. Huxley and Clarence Darrow. Interesting. Loving this part, talking about the evolution, the history of evolution, the evolution of evolutionary theory. Kind of interesting. Continuing here. Evolution and scientific psychology. Any theory of evolution raises two questions that can engender psychological research programs. The first I will call the species question. If the body and brain are products of organic evolution, then we may ask in what ways this inheritance has shaped the thought and behavior of organisms. Hume erected his philosophical system on his science of human nature, but he did not inquire into why we have the nature we have. Darwinian evolution makes it feasible to ask and answer Hume's unasked question because we ask how each aspect of human nature is adaptive in the struggle for existence. This question leads to comparative psychology, ethology, and evolutionary psychology, which study species differences in mental and behavioral capacities, differences presumably created by evolution. However, in the context of the psychology of consciousness, the first Darwinian question asked was, why are we conscious at all? The second psychological question raised by evolution we may call the individual question. As the individual creature grows up, how can it be seen as adapting psychologically to the environment in a way analogous to organic evolution? This question leads to the study of learning, research designed to uncover how the individual adjusts to the environment. The species question and the individual question are interrelated. If species differences are great, then different psychologies of individual adaptation will be needed for different species. If, on the other hand, species differences are small, then the same laws of individual learning will apply to all individuals, regardless of species. In this chapter, we trace the development of the psychology of adaptation and soon discover that its proponents adopt the latter line of thought. Gall's phrenology had implied a comparative psychology that looked for species differences in the possession of mental faculties. To a phrenologist, structural differences in the brain meant structural differences in the mind. However, by the middle of the 19th century, the sensory-motor concept of the brain had vanquished phrenology among scientists, and associationism was displacing faculty psychology among philosopher-psychologists. The view of the brain as an initially formless associative machine and the view of the mind as a tabula rasa awaiting associations combined to cause psychologists to focus on the individual question and minimize species differences. Ooh, pardon, sorry. Woo! Dinner's just coming on up. Pardon me, excuse me, that was very uncouth. The beginnings of the psychology of adaptation in Britain. Lamarckian psychology, Herbert Spencer, born 1820, died 1903. In the summer of 1854, Herbert Spencer began to write a psychology whose lines of thought had scarcely anything in common with the lines of thought previously pursued. His work appeared the following year, 1855, as Principles of Psychology. This book gave Spencer a good claim to be the founder of the psychology of adaptation. Bain had integrated associationism and the sensory-motor conception of brain function, but although he acknowledged the validity of Darwinian evolution, his psychology remained part of classical pre-evolutionary associationism. Writing before Darwin, Spencer integrated associationism and sensory-motor physiology with Lamarckian evolution. Consequently, he anticipated the psychology of adaptation. Furthermore, not only did he raise the two evolutionary questions, but he also answered them in ways that have been basic to Anglo-American psychology until about 1980. In 1854, Spencer wrote, "If the doctrine of evolution is true, the inevitable implication is that mind can be understood only by observing how mind is evolved. Here is the starting point of the psychology of adaptation." Spencer proceeded to discuss both evolutionary psychological questions. Considering the individual, he viewed development as a process by which the connections between ideas come to mirror accurately the connection between events prevailing in the environment. The connections between ideas are built up by contiguity. Wrote Spencer, the growth of intelligence at large depends upon the law that when any two physical The growth of intelligence at large depends upon the law that when any two psychical states occur in immediate succession, an effect is produced such that if the first subsequently recurs, there is a current tendency for the second to follow it. This tendency is strengthened as ideas are more frequently associated together. Like Bain, Spencer attempted to deduce the laws of mental association from the sensory-motor constitution of the nervous system and brain. In general, then, Spencer's analysis of the individual mind is that of atomistic associationism. He broke down the more complex phenomena of intelligence into basic elements. What Spencer adds to Bain is the evolutionary conception, viewing the development of the mind as an adaptive adjustment to environmental conditions. Spencer pictured the brain as a sensory-motor associative device, stating that the human brain is an organized register of infinitely numerous experiences. His view has two important consequences. Given the Lamarckian idea of the heritability of acquired characteristics, instinct can be made acceptable to associationists and empiricists. Following the passage just quoted, Spencer described how the brain accumulates experiences during the evolution of that series of organisms through which the human organism has been reached. Thus, innate reflexes and instincts are simply associative habits, so well learned that they have become part of species' genetic legacy. Such habits may not be acquired during an individual's life, but they are still acquired, following the law of association, in the life of the species. Innate ideas need no longer terrify the empiricist. The second consequence of Spencer's integration of evolution and the sensory-motor concept of nervous function is more portentous. Hold on, wait, let's look up this word. I haven't seen this word before. Portentous. Definition. What is this? Of or like a portent, of momentous significance, the portentous year in the Canadian history, done in a pompously or overly solemn manner, so as to impress. Okay, so we're going to put this portentous. I'm going to put this in the chat to share. Portentous, adjective, and it means this. Hold on. Portent, like important. Okay, that makes sense. Yeah, okay. Okay, let's start that. Yes. So an important year, portentous. Okay, continuing. Let's try that again. Sorry, portentous. The second consequence of Spencer's integration of evolution and the sensory-motor concept of nervous function is more portentous or important. Differences in the mental processes of different species reduce to the number of associations the brains are able to make. All brains work the same way, by association, and they differ only quantitatively in the richness of their associations. As Spencer put it, the impressions received by inferior intelligences, even down to the very lowest, are dealt with after a like model. Thus, his answer to the species question is to deny qualitative differences among species and admit only quantitative associational differences. This idea extends to differences within as well as between species. The European inherits from 20 to 30 cubic inches more brain than the Papuan. Wow. Yeah. That's so racist. Let's read that again. European inherits from 20 to 30 cubic inches more brain than the Papuan, meaning Europeans have more absorbance, bigger brains. This implies that the civilized man has also a more complex or heterogeneous nervous system than the uncivilized man, as he wrote in First Principles. I'm amazed that we're on page like 290, and Thomas Hardy Leahey is just now letting some of the racism of these very important thinkers seep through. Like, this is probably the only blatantly racist quote that we've had so far, even though literally everybody he's named in this text as being important has said something explicitly racist. And I would go so far as to say as explicitly anti-black from almost everybody, from Kant, Hume, Descartes, all these guys. Okay, continuing here. Anyway. Spencer's framework shaped the psychology of adaptation for over a century. Comparative psychology would be directed towards studying associative learning in a small number of species, aimed at quantifying a single dimension of associative intelligence, along with species, could be arranged. Moreover, such studies could be performed in the laboratory, ignoring an organism's native environment. If the brain is no more than an initially empty stimulus response associating mechanism, then it is irrelevant whether the associations are natural or contrived. In fact, the laboratory offers greater control over the process than does naturalistic observation. It also follows that if all organisms learn the same way, then the results of studies of simple animal learning, with their precision, replicability, and rigor, can be extended without serious modification to human learning. We will find that all these conclusions are of fundamental importance to behaviorism. The 20th century psychology of adaptation. Behaviorists sought laws of learning that they thought would be valid for at least all mammals, and they extended animal findings to human psychology, often without supporting data. Spencer applied his evolutionary ideas to contemporary social problems, producing a political theory unfortunately called social Darwinism. He argued that natural selection should be allowed to take its course on the human species. Government should do nothing to help the poor, weak, and helpless. In nature, weak animals and their maladaptive heredity traits are weeded out by natural selection. This should be the way in human society as well, said Spencer. Government should leave the cosmic process alone, for it will perfect humanity for the selection of the fittest. To help human nature will only serve to degrade the species by allowing them to have children and thus pass on their hereditary tendency to fail. When Spencer toured America in 1882, he was lionized. Social Darwinism had great appeal to laissez-faire capitalist society where it could justify even cutthroat competition on the grounds that such competition perfected humanity. Although it promised eventual perfection of the species, social Darwinism was profoundly conservative, for all reform was seen as tampering with nature's laws. The American social Darwinist Edward Youmans complained bitterly about the evils of the robber barons, but when asked what he proposed to do about them, he replied, "Nothing." Only centuries of evolution could relieve human problems. Once again, I'm sure also social Darwinism was very popular among the, let's say, KKK constituency of America. Darwinian psychology. Spencer wrote his Principles of Psychology 4 years before Darwin published The Origin of Species. In later editions, Spencer adjusted his text to reflect Darwin's ideas. Meanwhile, Darwin and others began to apply Darwinian thinking to animal and human psychology. Darwin on humans. The central challenge of Darwin's Origin of Species concerned what Huxley called man's place in nature. In the comprehensive naturalistic scheme of evolution, man was made part of nature, no longer a being who transcended it. This implication was immediately seen by all, whether they agreed with it or not. Yet, the Origin itself contains very little on human psychology. We know that in Darwin's early notebooks dating back to the 1830s, he was concerned with these topics, but he seems to have set them aside from his initial publication as too risky. It was not until 1871 that he finally published The Descent of Man, which brought human nature within the scope of natural selection. Darwin's aim in The Descent of Man was to show that man is descended from some lowly organized form, a conclusion that he regretted would be highly distasteful to many. He broadly compared human and animal behavior and concluded, the difference in mind between man and the higher animals, great as it is certainly one of degree and not of kind. We have seen that the senses and intuitions, the various emotions and faculties such as love, memory, attention, curiosity, imitation, reason, etc., of which man boasts may be found in an incipient or even sometimes in a well-developed condition in lower animals. Even the ennobling belief in God is not universal with man. Okay, proof of that. Descent was not primarily a work of psychology. It mainly attempted to incorporate humans fully into nature. Darwin felt that Spencer had already laid the foundations for an evolutionary psychology. Yet Darwin's work contrasts importantly with Spencer's principles. Darwin followed philosophical faculty psychology, relegating association to a secondary factor in thought. Partly as a consequence, Darwin was concerned almost exclusively with the species question, for he assumed that evolution shaped the faculties. He also allowed, I just want to make sure my system is working. Okay, yes, all right. He also allowed great scope to the effects of heredity, sounding at times like an extreme nativist. For Darwin, both virtue and crime were heritable tendencies. Woman is genetically inferior to man in whatever he takes up. On the other hand, Darwin agreed with Spencer that the nature of species differences is quantitative rather than qualitative, and that well-learned habits can become innate reflexes. Lamarckian psychology and Darwinian psychology differed only in emphasis, not in content. The major difference is that Darwin's psychology is part of a materialistic evolutionary biology. Spencer's psychology in contrast, was part of a grand metaphysics that tended toward dualism and postulated an unknowable forever beyond the reach of science. Darwin sheared off his metaphysical growth from the psychology of adaptation. The spirit of Darwinian psychology. Francis Galton, born 1822, died 1911. We have already met Galton as a founder of mental testing. We now take up Galton as a psychologist of adaptation. Galton was an outstanding example of that distinct Victorian type, the gentleman dilettante. Independently wealthy, he was able to turn his inventive mind to whatever he chose. He traveled over most of Africa and wrote a manual for travelers in wild lands. He empirically investigated the efficacy of prayer. He pioneered the use of fingerprints for personal identification. He invented composite photographic portraiture. Many of his wide-ranging investigations were psychological or sociological. He once tried to understand paranoia by suspecting everyone he met of evil intentions. He canvassed the female beauties of Great Britain, trying to ascertain which county had the most beautiful women. He studied twins to sort out the contributions of nature and nurture to human character, intellect, and behavior. He tried to use indirect behavioral measures, rate of fidgeting, to measure a mental state, boredom. He invented the free association technique of interrogating memory. He used questionnaires to collect data on mental processes such as mental imagery. As we have learned, he applied anthropomorphic tests to thousands of individuals. Galton's body of research was so eclectic that it did not add up to a research program, so he cannot be considered a psychologist in the same sense as Wundt, Titchener, or Freud. However, Galton made important contributions to the growing psychology of adaptation. He broadened psychology to encompass topics excluded by Wundt. In his inquiries into the human faculty, he wrote, "No professor of psychology can claim to know the elements of what he teaches, unless he is acquainted with the ordinary phenomenon of idiocy, madness, and epilepsy. He must study the manifestations of disease and congenital folly, as well as those of high intellect." Wundt wanted to understand only the normal adult mind. Galton inquired into any human mind. Spencer began the psychology of adaptation, but Galton epitomized it. His eclectic attitude concerning both method and subject matter, as his use of statistics, would strongly characterize Darwinian psychology from this point on. Above all, his interest in individual differences points to the future. In German rationalist fashion, Wundt wanted to describe the transcendent human mind. He quite literally found the study of individual differences to be foreign and the existence of individual differences to be a nuisance. Guided by evolution, especially the concept of variation, Galton, however, was interested in all those factors that make people different. The study of individual differences is an essential part of Darwinian science, for without variation there can be no differential selection and no evolutionary improvement of the species. Improvement of the human species was precisely Galton's aim. Underlying his various investigations was not a research program, but rather a religious duty. He was convinced that the most important individual differences, including those of morals, character, and intellect, are not acquired. His great aim was to demonstrate that these characteristics are innate and then to measure them so that they could inform the procreative behavior of humanity. Eugenics is proposed, Galton proposed to show that a man's natural abilities are derived by inheritance, under exactly the same limitations as are the form and physical features of the whole organic world. Consequently, as it is easy, notwithstanding these limitations, to obtain by careful selection a permanent breed of dogs or horses gifted with peculiar powers of running, or of doing anything else, so it would be quite practicable to produce a highly gifted race of men by judicious marriages during several consecutive generations. Wow. Galton's main interest was in the improvement of individuals, and he thought selective breeding would improve humanity faster than would improved education. Galton's program for selective human breeding was a form of positive eugenics, a term he invented, which attempted to get especially fit individuals to marry one another. Galton proposed that examinations be used to discover the 10 most talented men and women in Great Britain. At a public ceremony recognizing their talent, each will be offered £5,000, a staggering sum in days when a moderately frugal person might live on £1 or so a week, as a wedding present should they choose to marry one another. Galton's proposals gained few adherents when he first set them in 1869. Just after the turn of the century, however, Britons were more disposed to listen. In the wake of their near defeat in the Boer War in South Africa and the gradual recession of their empire, Britons began to worry that they were degenerating as a nation. In 1902, the army reported that 60% of Englishmen were unfit for military service, setting off a furious public debate on the physical deterioration after the name of the army report of the British people. In this atmosphere, warriors of all political stripes were excited by Galton's eugenics program for race improvement. In 1901, Carl Pearson, born 1857 and died in 1936, an intimate of Galton's. Carl Pearson, an intimate of Galton's who had extended and perfected Galton's statistical approach to biology, pressed Galton to re-enter the fray for eugenics. Pearson was a socialist who opposed conservative laissez-faire social Darwinism and hoped to replace it with planned, politically enforced programs of eugenics. Wow. Galton agreed, despite his advanced age, to take up the cause again, and in that year he gave a public lecture on eugenics and began to work for the establishment of eugenics policies. In 1904, he gave £1,500 to establish a research fellowship in eugenics and a eugenics record office at the University of London. In 1907, he helped found the Eugenics Education Society, which began to publish a journal, Eugenics Review. Eugenics appealed to people all across the political spectrum. Conservative establishment leaders used alleged laws of heredity and development to support their crusade for moral, especially sexual, reform. Social radicals could press eugenics into service as part of their programs for political and social reform. Eugenics was much talked about in the first decade of the 20th century in Britain. Despite the attention it received, British eugenics, in contrast to American eugenics, enjoyed only limited success in affecting public policy. Galton's program of rewards was never seriously considered. Some attention was given to laws enforcing negative eugenics, attempts to regulate the reproduction of the alleged unfit, but these were relatively mild measures that placed the socially incapacitated in institutions where they could receive care. British eugenicists were themselves divided on the need for government eugenics programs. The social radical eugenicists, in particular, urging education and voluntary control instead of legal compulsions. British eugenics was never fueled, as American eugenics was, by racism and race hysteria. Well, that's a lie. That's a lie. British eugenicists were more concerned to encourage the reproduction of the middle and upper classes, whose birth rates had long been in decline, than to restrict spitefully the reproduction of allegedly inferior races. Although eugenics began in Britain, in the English-speaking world, it was practiced mostly in America, as we shall see. Okay, that's a lie. That's a lie. Because would the British eugenicists of that time say, hey, that black African woman, we should pair her with our fittest white British man? Of course not, they wouldn't say that. So of course it was fueled by race. Because all the eugenicists at that time agreed that the whites were the superior race. But this is what's frustrating about this book sometimes. Sometimes there's a lot of knowledge in game, but I am reading from the hands of a man at worst who's a racist and at best is one of those I don't see color, we're post-racial race denialist, if that makes sense. So yeah, that's one of my frustrations with this book. Let me just check and make sure the stream is running. Let me make sure everything is running good. Okay, so we're still on this page. We still have about 10 more minutes. I'm going to read this last section right here, and then we're going to call it a day and then go on to the live stream, the call-in show. So let's try to kill this in about 9 or 10 minutes. The rise of comparative psychology. A psychology based on evolution should call forth research aimed at comparing the various abilities of different species of animals. Simple comparison of human and animal abilities goes back to Aristotle, and both Descartes and Hume buttressed their philosophies with such considerations. The Scottish faculty psychologists argued that humans' moral faculty distinguished them from animals. Galton studied animals and people to discover the special mental faculties of each species. The theory of evolution, however, gave comparative psychology a powerful impetus, placing it in a wider biological context and giving it a specific rationale. In the late 19th century, comparative psychology grew in strength until, in the 20th century, learning theorists studied animals in preference to humans. Modern comparative psychology may be said to have begun in 1872 with the publication of Darwin's The Expression of the Emotions in Man and Animals. The new approach is heralded by Darwin's statement early in the book: "No doubt, as long as man and all other animals are viewed as independent creations, an effectual stop is put to our natural desire to investigate as far as possible the causes of expression. However, he who admits that the structure and habits of all animals have been gradually evolved will look at the whole subject in a new and interesting light." In the rest of his book, Darwin surveyed the means of emotional expression possessed by humans and animals, noting the continuity between them and demonstrating their universality among the races of humanity. Darwin's theory of how emotional expressions evolved as Lamarckian, actions which at first voluntary soon became habitual and at last hereditary, may then be performed even in opposition to the will. Darwin's theory was that our involuntary emotive expressions have gone through this development. Darwin's proposal that facial expression of emotion is universal and innate was discarded by behaviorists, but has been revived by Paul Ekman. Darwin's early work in comparative psychology was systematically carried on by his friend George John Romanes, born 1848 and died in 1894. In Animal Intelligence, published in 1883, Romanes surveyed the mental abilities of animals from protozoa to apes. In later works, such as Mental Evolution in Man, published in 1889, Romanes attempted to trace the gradual evolution of mind down the millennia. Romanes died before he could complete his comparative psychology. His literary executor was C. Lloyd Morgan, born 1852 and died in 1936. Who, in his own Introduction to Comparative Psychology, published in 1903, objected to Romanes' overestimation of animal intelligence. Romanes had quite freely attributed complex thinking to animals from analogy to his own thinking. Morgan, in formulating what has since been called Morgan's canon, argued that inferences of animal thinking should be no more than absolutely necessary to explain some observed behavior. The last of the early founding British comparative psychologists was the philosopher Leonard T. Hobhouse, born 1864 and died in 1928. Hobhouse used the data of comparative psychology to construct a general evolutionary metaphysics. He also carried out some experiments on animal behavior that in some respects anticipated Gestalt's work on animal insight and were designed to counter the artificiality of behaviorist animal experiments. These comparative psychologists combined faculty psychology with associationism in their theories of development and collected some interesting facts. What proved important and controversial about their work, however, was their method and goal. What Romanes consciously introduced to psychology was an objective behavioral method in contrast to the subjective method of introspection. We cannot observe the minds of animals, only their behavior. Nevertheless, the theoretical goal of the British animal psychologists was never merely to describe behavior. Rather, they wanted to explain the workings of animal minds, and therefore they attempted to infer mental processes from behavior. The problems involved in this research program importantly affected the development of behaviorism, which was founded by American comparative psychologists. Methodologically, comparative psychology began with Romanes's anecdotal method. He collected vignettes of animal behavior from many correspondents and sifted through them for plausible and reliable information from which to reconstruct the animal mind. The anecdotal method became an object of derision among the experimentally oriented Americans, especially E. L. Thorndike. The method lacked the control available in the laboratory and was felt to overestimate animal intelligence. The anecdote method did have the virtue, largely unappreciated at the time, of observing animals in natural, uncontrived situations. We will find that animal psychology ran into real difficulties in the 1960s because of its exclusive reliance on controlled laboratory methods that overlooked the animal's ecological histories. Theoretically, inferring mental processes from behavior presented difficulties. It is altogether too easy to attribute to animals complex mental processes that they may not possess. Any simple behavior can be explained incorrectly as the result of complex reasoning. Anyone who today reads Romanes's Animal Intelligence will feel that he frequently committed this error. Morgan's canon was an attempt to deal with this problem by requiring conservative inferences. In his own treatment of animal mind, Morgan contributed a distinction that unfortunately was less known and less influential than his famous canon of simplicity. Morgan distinguished objective inferences from projective, or as he called them in the philosophical jargon of his time, ejective inferences from animal behavior to animal mind. Imagine watching a dog sitting at a street corner at 3:30 one afternoon. As a school bus approaches, the dog gets up, wags its tail, and watches the bus slow down and then stop. The dog looks at the children getting off the bus, and when one boy gets off, it jumps on him, licks his face, and together the boy and the dog walk off down the street. Objectively, Morgan would say we can infer certain mental powers possessed by the dog. It must possess sufficient perceptual skills to pick out one child from the crowd getting off the bus, and it must possess at least recognition memory, for it responds differently to one child among all the others. Such inferences are objective because they posit certain internal cognitive processes that we are unaware of in our own case. When you see a friend, you wave and say hi without any awareness of the face recognition process. On the other hand, we may be tempted to attribute a subjective mental state, happiness, to the dog on analogy with our own consciously felt happiness when we greet a loved one who has been absent. Unlike objective inferences, projective inferences are based on analogy to our own subjective mental states, because in making them, we project our own feelings onto the animal. Objective inferences are legitimate in science, Morgan held, because they do not depend on analogy, are not emotional, and are susceptible to later verification by experiment. Projective inferences are not scientifically legitimate because they result from attributing our own feelings to animals and cannot be more objectively assessed. Morgan did not claim that animals do not have feelings, only that their feelings, whatever they may be, fall outside the domain of scientific psychology. Morgan's distinction is important, but it was neglected by later comparative psychologists. When Romanes's methods of anecdote and inference were challenged by American animal psychologists in the 1890s, the subjectivity of projective inference, calling rats happy and carefree, led to wholesale rejection of any discussion of animal mind. Had Morgan's distinction between objective and projective inference been heeded, however, it might have been seen that although projective inferences are scientifically worthless, objective inferences are perfectly respectable. However, no matter how conservatively and carefully mind might be reconstructed from behavior, it remained possible for the skeptic to doubt. As Romanes put it, skepticism of this kind is logically bound to deny evidence of mind, not only in the case of lower animals, but also in that of the higher, and even in that of men other than the skeptic himself. For all objections which could apply to the use of inference would apply with equal force to the evidence of any mind other than that of the individual objector. Such skepticism constitutes the essence of methodological behaviorism. Behaviorists admitted that they were conscious but refused to posit mental processes to scientifically explain the behavior of animals or of human beings on the grounds that they could not be verified by external observers. The psychology of adaptation began in England, where the modern theory of evolution was born. However, it found more fertile ground in one of Britain's former colonies, the United States. There, it became the only psychology, and as the United States came to dominate psychology, so did the psychology of adaptation. And that's where we're going to end it for today, for today's reading. Hopefully you enjoyed that. We'll pick up on the psychological ideas in the New World, general, intellectual, and social environment. This is page number 296. Page 296. And this chapter, if it ever wants to work, continues until page 325. Quite a lot, but that's only about, 28 pages or so. So we can knock that out tomorrow. I think we did quite a lot, actually. We did, how many? 13 pages today. So we can knock out 25. That's going to be maybe an hour and a half or an hour and 45 to do. So we'll knock out all that stuff tomorrow, then start on chapter 11, hopefully on Monday, if I have some time. Hopefully you enjoyed this live stream. We're going to be doing the live call-in show right after this. Give me about 8 or 10 minutes or so to set it all up. Y'all be easy out there, and peace.